Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brodt. It's a pleasure to be with you once again, and we will endeavor to record an episode about flowers for Shavuos. We all know there's a minhag in Klal Yisrael, flowers at home, flowers in shul. The kids come home with the arts and crafts, which seem to indicate that there were flowers on Har Sinai. So we're going to get to all this and hopefully hear some things that at least I didn't know before. Maybe some of the audience didn't know before either. And this should be something which should be interesting to people. And once again, if you have any questions or comments or suggestions or feedback, please email either myself at shweidm@ou.org or Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brodt at gmail.com. And without further ado, here is Rabbi Brodt. How are you today?
So basically, just to start with two very short introductions. Number one, I was zeichet that this topic, I've been already Isaac in it, I would say, for over 30 years. Looking into collecting, I was interested in it at some level or another over the years. I wrote a little bit about it in my doctorate on the Magen Avrohom. Some of it I'll be sharing some of the nekudas today. Some of it I worked on in Machon Adhena, which I've mentioned also in the past, which is where I was discussing inyanim relating to Galicia. So here I was tracking down how we're going to get to the Gra, his psak about what he said about flowers and how the Gedolim in Galicia dealt with it. We're going to touch on that a little bit. I also dealt with a little bit about the Rama there, so some of that work will also be mentioned here. This also eventually led into expanding work on the Chayai Adam, which we'll also discuss over here, which I eventually turned into writing a book, Amir Tashem, about the Chayai Adam. And just one last nekuda is, I'm dedicating this to, I don't do too much for my shul, based tefillah in Ramat Beit Shemesh, but I help them every year with the putting up of the flowers in the shul. And so I dedicate to the people that we put up the flowers. Even as you'll see, it's a minhag Yisrael Tayrehi, and that's what we're about to begin learning, the early Makairis for that.
So it seems like this is a rabbit hole in Mahadran that you've been involved in for...
Yes, it's a rabbit hole that I would say it would be too many rabbit holes to explain all the rabbit holes of where they led me. But that's just a drop. Okay, yes, correct. Okay, so now the way people like to speak always is you begin with some stories. So we're going to say three very short stories that people heard at some point or another, at least one or two of them. Story number one relates to Chassam Sofer. It seems they always used to make a very fancy, elaborate decoration using grass, trees, and all types of good-smelling stuff, and they would put it where he sat. It sounds like even like some type of small sukkah. And somehow a Gabbai saw it and he was against it. Maybe they went out of control. They didn't. And he took it down. He didn't let them do it. And it seems that this Gabbai didn't last that year. It seems like some Sefer was upset. This is one scary story, they say, starting up with a minhag. Another story that people, that this is Rabbi Kiva Yosef Schlesinger, an interesting character, to put it mildly, when he's talking about Mendelssohn, someone that he couldn't stand. So he says that when he came to Berlin, so the first year he did the proper minhag Shavuos, they saw that he was doing everything right with the flowers and the trees and everything. And then the next year they saw he wasn't doing it. So they asked the Rav of the city, what happened? So he says, why the first year did he do it? So he said he's starting to he became a kaifer. Obviously this is extreme kanoistic a story to portray Mendelssohn in a certain way, which the Lev Ivri wrote a whole sefer to this thing, but he was coming to use it as an example with the story of how he was noyig with Shavuos. Obviously, I don't think there's even any truth to the story, but we're not going to go into that. The third story is, it seems in some city, some shtetl in Lita, they had the trees and they had they had an elaborate thing, and the Bachrim, and a Bacher was touching it, and the Gabbai was fuming. What are they touching it? They're going to ruin it. And he hit him he hit one of the Bachrim very strong. The the Rav saw this happening, so the Rav said he's abolishing this minhag so that a Shiva Bacher shouldn't get so beaten up for this minhag, even though this Gabbai was looking at it, it's a minhag, we have to be Mahadran and Mahadran, but I guess he was taking it to an extreme. Anyway, these are just three stories. of the widespreadness of this minhag.
Okay, beautiful. So I don't sit in a library like you have with all of those books behind me. I have like some of the classic books here. If I had to start learning some of the classic sources, where would we begin? And maybe you touched on it. Has anybody written like a dedicated sefer on this? Anything dedicated academia? Or this is something that you're going to have to put together yourself?
Okay, so first of all, as of today, there's no academic or from book just on this topic, but there's many articles, speeches on the internet, and Tyrus in Hebrew and English. Every year people get into it, and people have a Nacha Knech, and they made a Nacha discovery. So it's a very hot topic in the past bunch of years. I did collect a bunch of articles that people wrote about and see what they said. It's very interesting. And as like everything else, there's an X amount of sources that people get to. Some of them we'll mention today, and everyone has their take of how they read and put together the sources. I hope that what I'm presenting is actually some material that no one else has said, but it could be someone did. You'll let me know now. But back to your original question that you said is it's actually very interesting, and that will take us backwards a drop. Hilchos Shavuos, if you look into Hilchos Shavuos, so if you look in the Rishonim, there's no Hilchos Shavuos really. If you look in the Rambam, there's no Hilchos flowers and Hilchos milchiks and Hilchos staying up at night. What we have as our Mayerdik Shavuos with all the different things, Agdamas, all these different rich relating Megillas Rus, you open up your Rambam, you're not going to see this. If you go to the tour, you're also not going to really see this. Now, okay, let's fast forward a little further. The Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, he goes ahead, collects from all the Rishonim, whatever he had and everything, and you'll see Shavuos, there's nothing doing. There's no Hilchos Milchiks, there's no staying up at night. Now, what's fascinating is why do we stay up at night? So obviously that's his own episode, rabbit hole, not for now, but everyone always knows the Beis Yosef and his Magen, they stayed up. The Beis Yosef doesn't bring it down in the Beis Yosef or in Shulchan Aruch. The Rama doesn't bring it down. So were they doing it? Weren't they doing it? Obviously, that's a different episode. But point is, if you look at your Hilchos Shavuos, nothing's happening there. What happens? So the Beis Yosef, when's Beis Yosef published? Around the years 1550. We're going to give a pretty rough, almost an exact date around when it's published. Okay. Now, at that time, mamish in those years, a work comes out, a Machzor comes out, the Machzor Maglei Tzedek, and this Machzor has in it halachas from a Yid, Rabbi Yamin Halevi. It seems this Machzor, this is the year 1550, comes out, and it comes out a few more times, and this Machzor, a lot of people were fascinated with this Machzor. All the bibliographers of this, they're busy with all different types of aspects, whether it's Meir Ben Yo, Yitzchak Rifkin, and a lot of other people discussing different things about this Machzor. But what's significant about this Machzor is that Gedolei HaPoskim, such as the Magen Avrohom, Eliezer, Makar Chaim, and a few others, they had this Machzor, and they used this Machzor for the halachas that this Rabbi Yamin Halevi incorporated throughout this Machzor. Okay, fine. Where was this Machzor from? This is for the Ashkenazi Kehila in Saloniki. Now, what does it say over there? It says as follows: on Chag Shavuos, Erev Chag Shavuos, as it's getting the ark, they would put out Shoshanim Vasavim in the Beis HaKnesses. For what reason? L'chvoid HaTorah, for kavod HaTorah. Now, okay, fine. So this is when? 1550. So actually is, as far as I'm able to tell as of today, this is the first printed Maramakim that mentions flowers. Okay, number 2. What's his Makar? So now we know that there was 2 very, very important sources floating around from that time and onwards. One is the Maharil, and one is the Sefer Rabbi Isaac Tirna, from the Minhagim of Rabbi Isaac Tirna. So the Maharil, who is born as late as 1375. They discuss the date of his birth, but anyway, 1375. He dies 1427. His Talmud wrote down all his Hanhagas, and it gets published. He's in the time before the publishing era, but it gets published the first time when? In the years after this Maglei Tzedek. Okay, now. But it's clear is that the Maglei Tzedek, from other sources, he had the Maharil in manuscript. he had access to a great library over there, which is discussed in the Machzor that he publishes. Yosef Hacker deals with this, but there was a massive library in Saloniki at the time, and so it seems it even had manuscripts. Okay, but anyway, what it says in the Maharil is not the exact lashon what the Maglei Tzedek said. He says that they put on the floor of the Beis HaKnesset besamim shalasavim ubesheishanim. He adds in those are the same thing, but his reason is l'simchas haregel, for simchas haregel. So you could obviously ask a question: if it's simchas haregel, why is it associated with Shavuos and not with other Yom Tovim? That's our Aryeh. Anyway, Rabbi Isaac Tirna, he publishes. He is a contemporary of the Maharil. We're not going to get into his whole story, also, but we are going to get into the significance of the Maharil and Rabbi Isaac Tirna in one moment. But basically, Rabbi Isaac Tirna is born in 1380, dies in 1445, and he has a sefer called he has a massive sefer where it's not a massive sefer in size, but basically going through all aspects of the year, all the piyutim one says, and many different halachas. This is the source from it. It's also published in these years, in these years, and what happens is like this. It has in it also a work called Hagoyis Minhagim. In the Hagoyis Minhagim, it says that they would do it in the Beis. They would put asavim. This does not have sheishanim in the Beis HaKnesset. For what reason? L'simcha. It doesn't, and so that's similar to the Maharil. Okay. Now, what happens is like this: is that now we have the Maharil, we have Rabbi Isaac Tirna. Fast forward about 1570, the famous Yid Ramosha Israelis, the Rama, he feels the Beis Yosef is not doing justice, let's say, to the Chag HaShavuos. So he puts in, there's a Hagah over here in Shulchan Aruch, and it says as follows: they did Asavim and Shavuos in the Beis HaKnesset, and then he adds in Vahabatim, also at home. Zecher l'simchas matan Torah. So we went from the Maharil and Rabbi Isaac Tirna, the Hagoyis Minhagim, which said Simchas HaRegel or Stam Simcha, or L'Chaved HaTorah of the Maglei Tzedek, to L'Simchas Matan Torah. So we see from here, if you look at this very carefully, is that there's minor machlokes in the actual minhag already early on. From the Maharil, it sounds like they did it on the floor of the shul. According to Rama, he doesn't talk about the shul. If you put it up on the walls, it's also fine. The Maharil, they did it with what? Besamim and sheishanim. It smelled good. The Rama talks about grass. Maharil says it was only in the shuls. The Rama says it's also in the houses. The Maharil says a reason, and the Rama says a different reason. And not only that, if you're looking at let's say the Maglei Tzedek, which possibly the Rama might have seen, might not have seen, it's up for discussion, right? But the point is, he says l'kavod haTorah. So what's going on here? Anyway, but furthermore, is the Rama is extending this. Now, normally we open up the Darkei Moshe, but over here the Darkei Moshe doesn't tell us anything. So Rama's work Darkei Moshe, which was what he used to eventually turn into to incorporate as the Rama, where he explained a lot of times his sources, doesn't say anything. So we don't know what's the reason for the Rama or his Makairos. Now, why is that significant? Because many of the Makairos of the Rama for these type of topics is the Maharil and Rabbi Isaac Tirna. That's the significance of these two great Svarim. Now, in 1903, the Leket Yosher, which is a Talmud of the Truas Hadeshen, wrote down the Haggis of his Rebbe, and there he says that the Truas Hadeshen would taka do it where in the house. So it's possible that the Rama had this as a makar, and at least for the house aspect, which the Rama is extending, the makar is from the Trumas Hadeshen. Okay, but it's Yitachin, the Rama was not being mechadish something. He probably had some sources which we don't have today. Now, interestingly enough, a work that came out literally in the 1580s, this is right after the Rama, influenced probably by the Rama, unknown work called Derech HaToivim. And he says on Shavuos, the minhag is to do grass, sheishanim, b'kol makom shechaynim l'kavod haTorah. So it seems like he's taking the Rama, but he's using l'kavod haTorah as the reason. And then he says, why? L'kavod haTorah shenitna b'midbar matana levanim maminim. Because it was given the midbar matana maminim. Okay, but what does it have to do with grass? It's still unclear. L'maisa, there's a lavush. And this is the origin of everything. The Levush says, Zeichel Simchas Matan Torah. There was grass, Savav Har Sinai. How do we know? Because it says, Gam Hatzayin V'Bakar should not be there. Must be. Why couldn't they be there? Because there was Mara for the that they would have eaten the grass that was there. I saw someone say to the effect that it's a Chiddush because it's in the Midbar. So in the Midbar there's not stuff growing. So it must have been maybe that also. But Lamaisa, looking around, I was not able to find the hezber. What's the deeper nakuda behind that is? That's why the Maharil is much easier. The Maharil says it's pashut a simcha for simchas regel. But then there's a question: so why not every yontif? But if you look in the way the Maglei Tzedek has it, it's even better because it's l'chavar Torah. It's not symbolic to Har Sinai. It's a nice thing, and we're going to see an extension of this shortly of how this minhag developed at a certain point in time with this nakuda. But now let's backtrack for a minute. Adkan, we see that it's only the Maharil or Isaac Tirna. These are people that are active in the years 1370 and onwards. But what about earlier? Do we have any other early sources? Any possible Makayos from Yerushalayim? So interestingly enough, there's this fascinating work from Emanuel Haromi, Machberes Emanuel. It's written approximately 1321. In there we find, it says, basically, it seems it's without getting into the whole story behind the Sefer, but it says something to the effect that in Chodesh Sivan is when there are Sheshanim. That's when Torah was given. So now there's a minhag lefarbam heichal Hakodesh because it was given in the month when there is Sheshanim. So you put up flowers. Okay, so this is actually much more. It's a nicer thing. It makes more sense and everything. Now, obviously, people. So now this shtickle from Rabbi Emanuel Haromi eventually trickles down to Achronim a few hundred years later. Some of them have no idea that it's in this, that the Makar is this Emanuel Haromi. What's the significance? Because the Beis Yosef and Hilchos Shabbos, Siman Shin Zayin comes out very stark against the Sefer. So the obvious question is one allowed to use it or not? I'm not going to pass it. You have to ask your local rabbi. But I could, and I was recently, as a matter of fact, a week or two ago, someone asked me something relating to this. How could this person? He was relying on the Sefer. So I told him the following very short nakuda, which is as follows. There was a great Gaon who we mentioned recently, Masechta Saita, Rama Shoel Umashiv. Rama Shoel Umashiv was a great Galatiana Gaon. He wrote a tshuva sefer called Kol Mavasa. Another thing that he wrote was he was asked by Meir Shapiro to write some type of curriculum for the yeshiva, what the Bachram should learn and stuff like that. Turns out he lists all types of svarim and which age they should learn this and which age they should learn that. Amongst the different, each thing there is fascinating what he's doing, the curriculum. It's kedai to have a few episodes to explain the significance, what the svarim are and everything about it. But one of the svarim he says, it's Machberes Emanuel. Now I promise you no one will accuse that Rama Shoel Umashiv was a real frum yid. They say that the Chazon Ish said about him that you can rely on every single tshuva of his except one, because he talks about if you should say Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut, and he says you should. So someone said, I heard a person, his comment was, if the Chazon Ish said on a sefer of an Achron of his time that he can rely on every tshuva except that, and you end up saying Hallel, and you're relying on that tshuva, you're probably not going to go to Gehenna. Okay, fine. That's just a cute thing. Okay, anyway, but Kitzer, that's the only early source is this Emanuel Haromi. But now the question is, according to all these sources, the Rama and the Levush and everything that we just mentioned, there's only discussion of either flowers, grass, or Sheshanim, which is roses. Is there trees or branches and all these types of things, elaborate, if you look in pictures of shuls of past years and years, there's elaborate decorations. I think I've seen on the internet pictures that at one point people put up pictures of the different shuls, unbelievable elaborate decorations. Where's the makar for this? So interestingly enough, if we're looking for the makar of trees, it seems the first source is in the work found on the side of your standard Shulchan Aruch from Avrohom Abel Gambiner, the Magen Avrohom. He dies in 1683, and he writes in a work that's printed after he dies in 1692 that today people do noyagin lahamid ilanois bebeis hakneses ubebatim, in houses and in shuls. Now he says noyagin, so it seems it started to become noyag maybe in his time. Now why? Says the Magen Avrohom, I would like to be mechadish, possibly that the reason is because on Atzeres, what's the din on Peiros HaIlon? So it should remind us to daven for the Peiros HaIlon. Very interesting thing. So he's being machadish time for the minute because as we just saw, are the early sources for it? No, but people are doing it. So he's trying to be malame. What's the hezber? Okay. So here you see someone being machadish already a time and a minute, which is its own discussion, not for now. Anyway, there's a lot to discuss about this nakuda with the Magen Avrohom, but just the two marmakaimis about it, then we'll move on. One is it's a chibur adnei paz from Rabbi Ephraim Hecksher, a dayan in Altoona, printed in 1743, where it's clear we see they were doing this thing with the trees. He talks about another thing that they had Aseres Hadibris on top of the Arna Hakodesh. In many shuls today, they have such a thing. So on Chag Shavuos, they would have on the Ilonos, they would have some type of Aseres Hadibris on top of these Ilonos, some type of thing. But he was against such a minhag. But we see that they're doing it in the tree. They will put in the tree even the Aseres Hadibris. Okay. Interestingly enough, in a historical work from 1785, of Nikolsburg, he writes, he writes that it was very cold in 1785, and you'll see the significance of the date 1785. So they couldn't have trees to make this chelik of the minhag in where they were. Okay, but the question is there any other early sources for trees? Because as of now, I'm saying the early source is the Magen Avram. Anyway, fast forward. There's a chibur. It's called Shulchan Aruch from Yehudah in Modena. Now, this chibur, we're not going to go into discussion what it is right now, but it's published. It's written in 1616. That's a lot before the Magen Avram. So in there, I'm looking at it, and it says that they decorate the shuls and the base medrash and the houses with sheshanim, and then it says at the end, the anfe eitz avos, which is trees. So I'm like, oh man, here we have a much earlier source than the Magen Avram, that in Italy, which is where he was from, in 1616, l'chayra, they were doing the tree minhag. Anyway, this work, interestingly enough, was written not in Hebrew. He wrote this in Italian. Going back, and then it was also translated into English in the 1630s. And 1650s. It was written for the Goyim, actually, not for Jews. And going back to the first edition in Italian and in English, you'll see that there's no word trees there. It doesn't talk about trees. What happened is like this, and this is a common problem. The translator who translated this work into Hebrew was a Galicianer in the 1850s. So he recognized in his minhag, so he didn't do an exact translation. Yeah, the minhag is already in that point in time in Galicia, they did trees also. So he added in words that don't say in the original text, because, as I said, trees, l'chayr, was not existent. As far as I know, the Magen Avram period of time, which is in the 1670s, 1680s, is when they first started doing this minhag. But this is just a cute thing. It could be someone will discover a source that they did it before. But as I said, this Refuah Sheleima is not a source. Okay. Now the question is there any opposition to this minhag? So everyone knows, and this is we're going to get to shortly, is the Gra was against the minhag because it's and not to do it. Okay. Now, obviously, there's a lot to discuss about this, which we're not going to discuss, which is in the sugyas of and the gedarim of this, and all these type of issues. There's a massive tshuva in the Marik, which is which is also relating to the Gra about this Shiloh. We're not going to go into all those aspects right now, because that will be rabbit holes and rabbit holes and rabbit holes. But the part of the question when people talk about this, they say that if the Hanhaga is a ancient Hanhaga of Yidden, means that Yidden were doing this for hundreds of thousands of years, then it changes in the sugya of Bechukas Leiselechu. So they say that there's a medrash somewhere that says that when Haman was talking to Achashverosh, he's talking about the various minhagim the Yidden do, and one of them is that they do on Shavuos this minhag with asavim on Shavuos, and that they're a weird group of people and we should kill them. Now, if that's the case, we have a medrash that makes this very early, this minhag already, that in Achashverosh and Haman their time. Okay, so that's amazing, and it seems that in contemporary tshuvas, that would help them take away the problems of okay. Now, in order to discuss this, so I'm just going to say 2 points of this. Number one is as follows. There's a Shelah, which he publishes this in 1597 first. 1597, he has Ha'aris in the back of his father's work, Emek Bracha, and then it's also incorporated in the Shelah. And over there, it talks about a minhag that it seems they would give out in Shul, they would give out grass to smell after Shemoneh Esrei. So he says not to do it then, you should do it at a different time. Okay. Now, the Magen Avram brings down the Shelah, and the Paiskim handle the Shelah, and it's very cryptic what's going on over here. What seems to be happening is as follows, that we have another aspect in this minhag, and that is clear from, if you look at Rabbi Yosef Yisfa Shemesh, the Shamish of Vermais, when he's talking about worms, the Kila, what they did is they would have the floors of the shul, they would put grass and all these types of things, and around the Aron Kodesh they would put sheishanim and flowers and grass, and then they would give to the chashuva members flowers by their place so they could smell it. So it seems like there was some type of minhag to give it out in shul. So the shlo was against when they were giving it out because it was it was right after it was I guess it's going to be during Chazar Hashatz, and people might make a bracha on it. That's going to be a problem. But let's say to do it right before Sefer Torah is taken out, that's not a problem. Anyway, it seems that later on in Sholoniki, Rabbi Yosef Malchai talks about this, and there's other sources that this is what they did when they would by Kriyas HaTorah or by Hagba, different times they would put out flowers, and that's an extension of the minhag. Now that's what it sounds like in this supposed medrash that says that they would gather grass on Shavuos, that Haman was saying Tachashverosh. Now, Shelah is so. Now one nakuda is over here. If this is the makar from the minhag, and wait, the Shelah is saying it, and later on in the Shulchan Gavaya from Rabbi Yosef Malchai and other sources, this would sound much closer to the Rama, because the Rama was saying it has to do with something with the Torahs. That's why they did it dafka b'shas right before Kriyas HaTorah or right after Kriyas HaTorah, something symbolic to that, and it's not specific to Simchas HaRegel, which is how the Maharil did it. So this is a different shlav, a different step in the minhag. But what is the makar? Is there really an ancient makar from the times of the Achashverosh and Haman? So the answer is like this. It seems there's a Chida, and the Chida, as we know, was unbelievable what he knew. And in a short cryptic note in Birkei Yosef, he says as follows: There's a smach for the minhag brought down about flowers, and there's a Agada that says that they would do this with grass on Shavuos. What's he talking about? He doesn't say which medrash he's referring to. So there's a famous medrash. There's different versions of the medrash, also in Targum Sheine and Megillus Esther, and basically it sounds like they would gather apples that was thrown down on Shavuos. They would throw it down, then they would gather it. And there's all different sources to this medrash. Now, some people might realize this might trigger a memory, and that is on Simchas Torah, there's a Hasidish minhag, which is that they throw apples. So Atzeres the Shelah is if Atzeres is referring to Shavuos or Simchas Torah. And there's a lot of Makairis handling about this thing, but there's real Makairis that talk about, and this medrash it's referring to clearly, that they did throw apples or something on a yontif. But what about Shavuos and what about flowers? So, interestingly enough, if you pull out your Targum Sheine, early editions of Targum Sheine, you won't see anything of this. You'll see about the apples, and you'll see in the Midrashim, the similar Midrashim, they talk about apples or something, but they're not talking about flowers and Shavuos. They're talking about Simchas Torah. Anyway, what happens is like this. In 1770, a Pirush comes out on the Targum Sheine, and in there he throws in a word, and he throws in Sheishalim v'tapuchim. Now in Shavuos on Atzeres they throw not only apples, but they also throw flowers. So here we have an early source, l'chayra, and that's what the Chida is referring to, this nusach in this medrash, that they threw flowers and tapuchim. But it doesn't say why they did it or not, but now that we know there's Rama, the Maharil, all these different things, it will make sense that that's what it has to do with. Lamaisa, where did this 1770 Pirush on the Targum Sheine get this from? And none of the editions of the Midrashim, and we have a bunch, do we find anything about Sheshanim and Shavuos? Turns out there's a work, famous work, called the Chemdas Yomin. The Chemdas Yomin talks about a minhag, of flowers, that they would smell it, and they would put it on the Sefer Torah, this minhag sort of off the Shelah, and as I said, the Shulchan Gavaya, and then says the Chemdas Yomin, v'yesh smach l'minhag zeh b'Targum Sheine b'Megillah, and he refers to that medrash. Now, if you look in Hilchas Purim, the Chemdas Yomin, he brings down the whole shtickle of the Targum Sheine. He says it's a Ma'ir medrash. It's a fascinating what he's learned in Targum Sheine. So he brings down the whole thing in there. Middle, he says, "B'chag Shavuos mefazrim b'beis hakneses kol minei sheishalim v'tapuchim v'achakach loiktem oisam." They would spread it out, throw it around, and people would gather it. So we see here in the nusach of the Targum Sheine that the Chemdas Yomin is translating. So this is the makar for this fellow in 1770 who's writing a pirush on the Targum Sheine. He's using the Targum Sheine that's found. The whole Targum Sheine is found in the Chemdas Yomin. Now the Chida, we know, we're not going to get into this now. He will learn the Sefer, and he knew the Sefer Chemdas Yomin very well. So he remembered, the Targum Sheine, lefi that. It could be at that time he didn't have his Targum Sheine handy, he didn't remember. That's why it was in his head. It's a Targum Sheine. But now that we know it's not the Targum Sheine, none of the Midrashim talk about it. There's no early Makar, at least from Midrashim that we have been located today, that established this minhag for being early. Anyway, so now we could go further into the snagdus of the minhag. which is the opposition against the minhag. In the Orach HaShulchan, he talks very cryptic. He says there was a minhag to do this, to put in the shuls, grass and whatever, and then he says, mitamim sheyadua hagdolim shebedar, it stopped. And he doesn't explain. And sometimes we find the Orach HaShulchan uses this lashon. I suspect it's a cryptic lashon due to the censor. The censors in those times, the government only allowed certain words, things that were somehow being offending against the religion at the time. So then they made them take out these type of things. In Svarim, even in the times of Orach HaShulchan, there's a lot been written about this, not only about Orach HaShulchan in general, but now what am I talking about? We'll explain this shortly. Where's the source where the Gra says this? If you open up your Bir HaGra, the Gra doesn't say any such thing. But there's a sefer everyone's familiar with, from Avrohom Danzig, the Chayai Adam. It's first published in 1809, a few years after the Gra's Nifter, and again in the Sefer Chachmas Adam on Yehudah in 1815, and then later on in the Ma'aser Rav, and we see this Hanhaga that the Gra said not to do the minhag of flowers or the minhag of trees on Shavuos. And we'll see what exactly he says shortly. Now, Lamaisa, I already mentioned, we discussed about that it depends on the sugya of b'chukaseim leiselechu. So if you go, let's say the Shoel Umashiv in one of his chiburim on Yehudah, so he talks about this Indian, and he says he wants to be miyashiv the minhag of Klal Yisrael that they do ilanis on trees, even though the Goyin Rebellion Mivilna says is a problem of chukas goyim, as it's brought down where in the Sefer Chayai Adam. He says no, it's not true, because if it's something that's done for kavod and it's not done for avodah zara, then it's not going to be a problem of b'chukaseim leiselechu. How do I know how it's done? So he says I sent the people to go ask the goyim why they do this, why they put up trees. Why do they put up trees? And he said, because maybe it's a problem. And Lamaisa, again in 1848, he wrote this, and he said, it turns out they only do this because of kavod and nothing to do with the religion. So it's not a b'chukaseim leiselechu if they're only doing it because it's something nice. Goyim do something nice and we do something nice. So then there's no problems with b'chukaseim leiselechu. Lamaisa, much later on in Galicia, besides for the Shoel Umashiv, you have the Marsham. He talks about it in a tshuva, and he says that it's no problems of b'chukaseim leiselechu, because we're doing it differently than the way the goyim do it. They leave it outside their doors, we do it inside, and that's going to be mutter. I mean, say if we did trees on Shavuos outside of our shuls, maybe it's a problem. Similarly, we find even in a Litvish Makar, a very interesting work on astronomy called Itim Labina, he talks about the minhag in Lita, that they do it. And he says, yes, the Vilna Gaon was against it, but that was because the Vilna Gaon was talking about doing trees outside. But inside, in shuls, is not going to be a problem. So he's understanding that taka, it has to do with outside. Now, obviously, what's happening is like this. There's two things that are happening. One is that there's an understanding that it's possible that from the Shoel Umashiv one could come away with a conclusion, and the Marsham one could come away with a conclusion from this Makar that this diyun is about trees, and it goes very good the way I set it up. Maybe the Gra is not against flowers, and that was the original Minhag of the Rama. It's really this Magen Avrohom is talking about that. The Magen Avrohom either is not saying it's an early Makar, he's just saying that people started extending to the Minhag, and that the Gra is against. Okay, and says these Gedolim, that's not a problem. Why is it not a problem? For these different reasons. But number one is, what trees are they referring to? So obviously, people that grow up in places like America and Eretz Yisrael, you don't really understand this as much. But if you're growing up in America, you, for some reason, automatically assume it's referring to when do Goyim have trees and they decorate places with trees? Christmas time. So and that's what he's referring to. So since they do it then and now, and that's what the Gra is connecting, and fine. Now, first of all, is it so pashut that that's what the Gra is talking about? And more than that, is the Gra anti-trees or is he anti-everything? So first of all, there's a Makar from someone that lived in the times of Vilna, in the times of the Vilna Gaon. He's the son of the Baal HaPardes. His name was Ramar Epstein, and he brings down the Gra was against both trees and grass. So he seems to be putting it all together. L'maisa, what happens is like this. If you look in the Chayai Adam, so some Chayai Adams doesn't even have this halacha. What's going on here? So the answer is the Chayai Adam says, why was the Gra against it? Because it's the Goyish Minhag Lahamid Ilanis Bechag Shelahem and their Chag. So you can say it says Christmas. No, it doesn't. It says Pentecost. When's Pentecost? Pentecost is a Chag that takes place same time as Shavuos. Now the Galiciana Gedolim, either they didn't know about Pentecost, they didn't celebrate it. It's not clear exactly where it's celebrated. That's one aspect. So they equated it. The Chayai Adams that they had were censored. And that's why the Orach HaShulchan also refers to it that when you can't talk about a Goyish Chag because then the censor is going to take it out, that you're stopping a minhag because of that, whatever, it's going to cause problems. So, but the Chayai Adam, the first edition, if you pull out your first edition, you'll see that this was what's going on. And that's a problem because where the Gra was, he saw this going on. He saw in Vilna, which was a city. It wasn't this little shtetl, it was a massive city, that the Goyim had this minhag at the same time as Shavuos. So then that was a problem. So now the Shelah is only in Hilchos Pentecost. Were they doing trees and is it also grass? This is, you have to know the sugyas of Pentecost. Now this, I was the research of this and how I got to this was a good friend of mine from Lakewood, Eli Mark, and he was aimed on this prat. They spent time looking into it, and it requires a lot of iyun exactly what it is that is the Chag of Pentecost and what is exactly Hilchos Pentecost and Hilchos Christmas trees. Really, if it's anyway, when does Christmas trees come from? Did the Gra even know about Christmas trees? And it turns out Christmas trees are not so ancient as we might think. Okay, anyway, Bekitzer, fine. Now, I'm not going to get into all these different pratim, but the point is that's the makar and the Galiciana Paiskim that are coming with Limitz Chos, because they're assuming, it sounds like, because they're referring to Christmas as opposed to Pentecost. Okay, now just to conclude this with just many of the Paiskim talk about it. There's mamish a long list of Heintige Paiskim that talk about it, but we're not going to go through all of them. But time is short. And we're just going to say just the four points to conclude, and that's as follows. It's very possible the Gra, when he issued his psak, he was giving a psak for Vilna. He wasn't giving a world psak, because let us say, Lu Yitzur, in Saloniki, people did do this minhag, but they didn't know this Chag of Pentecost, so he wasn't talking about them. Now, what happens is a lot of times the psak is relative for a certain place. The Chayai Adam wrote it down, but he's writing also for Vilna. He had no idea the power of the print, how far out this is going to go. And this gets us to a very important point. There's a question that's asked by many, is how does the Gra become as famous as he does? Yes, we know the Gra was the Gra, and he was unbelievable in words we can't describe, but how does anyone hear about him? So different suggestions have been made over the years, and one suggestion that I suggest is through the Sefer Chayai Adam. Chayai Adam was published over 90 times. It was a best-selling work. There were chaburas learning Chayai Adam all over Europe, everywhere, learning this Sefer. And in this Sefer, he quotes and talks about the Gra, who he knew well, many, many times. He brings on Haggis to the Gra. This is before even the Ma'aser Rav, and this Sefer is getting everywhere. So if I would ask people to ask them, what's the most famous Gra that you ever heard of? I am pretty sure I would say it's the Anhaga of trees on Shavuos. You ask a guy, the guy tells he's giving a shir about Shavuos, or he's going to speak about it, someone's going to the Gra says it's very well known. I'm pretty sure I would venture to say it's the most famous known Gra. Could be I'm wrong. It's hard to prove that I'm wrong, but this is my thought about it. Now, so it happens like this. How does this Gra get out there? This person, the Gra, it's through this Sefer called the Chayai Adam, but it's not only this thing, it's everything. And it gets out there. L'mashal, there's a chibur there's a guy that writes, his name Marsham Kosover, he writes that in 91 editions that he saw of the Chayai Adam, and he tracked down that there's over 91 editions as far as he knows, 90 editions that he saw. But there's more. There's more probably. That's all that he was able to see, he says. Okay, anyway, the point I'm trying to make is like this. That the psak of the Chayai Adam could have been more a local psak, based on the Metzias where they were, and the Chayai Adam became a bestseller even beyond his wildest dreams. He says, actually, in Akdama, for the second edition, that the Sefer it went everywhere, beyond his wildest dreams. The same thing in Chayai Adam, everyone's learning it, but he didn't know this. So, therefore, it's not necessarily that the psak, whatever the psak of the Gra wasn't meant to be universal. So that's why it could be in the Bir Gra he didn't include it, because it wasn't. It was a thing he said in Vilna. Vilna, he sees what's going on, which is its own discussion. What does it mean? He sees. He was locked up in his room and he didn't even open up the window shades, even whatever. Is the Gra really a person that was cut off from society or not? We're not going to get into that anyway. But the point is, eventually the Minhagim of the Gra were it takes time, but as Rav Zevin writes, and interestingly enough, in Sefer V'Svarim, how does the Hanhagas of the Gra get out there? He says one of the ways is through the Luach Eretz Yisrael. When it comes to Eretz Yisrael, all of a sudden, Rav Tukashinsky wrote down different Hanhagas, and that's slowly what happens. Anyway, Bekitzer, the Hanhaga of the Gra of this Nakuda of the opposition, but in Lita, there's many Makairis that they didn't accept, at least this particular Hanhaga, that they did have trees. Lamashal, Rav Moshe Feinstein writes, in his youth, there was a machlokes, there was a Valozhna Talmidim, they wanted to steal the trees, and it was a big machlokes in the city, and the reason was they were coming mitzad to be Mekayim the Gra, but the city where he wasn't a Hasidic city, so to speak, or anti-Gra city, but it wasn't accepted. And there's many different sources. Just to quote one cute source, Chaim Grada, in a book of his, translated into English called Rabbis and Wives. Now, Chaim Grada was from Vilna. So in the story that he's talking about, he writes about Shavuos, the characters, and it seems someone had flowers, and he says as follows. He says, Kitzer, this woman prepared flowers. So her husband says to her, the Vilna Goyin did away with this custom because the Gentiles do the same thing on their holidays. She said, what if the Goyin did it? He did away with it. But now we're 100 years later, and we have our Talmud Chacham in our Kehila over here in Vilna, and he does it. So you see, even in Vilna, they did it. Anyway, and even though it's a novel, Chaim Grada, but it's Yadua, that what he wrote about was a reflection, mamish, of live accounts of what he witnessed in Vilna, and he was an amazing person of in amazing sense that he recorded. He was trying to record for what was destroyed, the Litvish world that was destroyed. He did an excellent job of recording that. Anyway, Lamashal Reb Shrei de Blitzky writes, he heard that even in the base Knesset of the Gra before the war, they had trees. And he says, Ad kedei kach. So he was bothered by it because he was a Granik, and in the shul of the Gra, that's already something else. But what I mean to say is there's Makairis and different Litvish Makairis. Now, interestingly enough, there was some Hasidim that accepted the Hanhag of the Gra, the Munkatcher. Once he says, Lamaisa, we don't do it. Out the Gra. He didn't do it, at least. I don't know if he was telling people or not, but anyway, fine. Anyway, I'm not going to go give the long list of all the different kehilas that did it, but just to conclude the last 2 points, and that's as follows. One is, what's interesting is today, everyone does it, pretty much, except a few hardcore Granics, because there are more Granics than there ever was before. But even in the Sephardi world, and if you look in many of the Makairis, the Sephardi world, there has nothing to do with it. As I said, as I started the whole story, the Beis Yosef, there's nothing. There's no Makairis. There's a work put out in the 1770s, like a Kitzer of the Shulchan Aruch, so to speak, from the son of the Chazi David. Yes, Shavuos, as I said, there's almost nothing there. Even 1770s, they're not doing it. At a certain point in time, you see, in Saloniki, I said the Shulchan Gavaya, Sephardi Makar, and others, Beis David, they talk about, by the Sefer Torah, they did a certain aspect, but the shuls being fancy, decorated, not. But today, you'll see, they talk about it as, basically, the Minhag slowly started from a more Ashkenazi Makarius, for the most part, which is the Maharil, Rabbi Isaac Tirna, Polish Minhag, all these places that gets the Rama, and all these places, and eventually today everyone's doing it. You look in all the different Svarim, the Hasidim that are doing it, and the Svardim are handling doing it, in all the different Svarim, and they all talk about the Targum Sheine as a Makar, but when you're going to the Makaris, it's not so pashut. And the last Makar for the story is as follows. There's a minhag, and this relates to also what kids come home with, is they would have these paper flowers, and they hang them up. So this is already going back over 100 years, and I didn't when I first was looking into this topic, I didn't realize there's a whole sugya in Hilchus of flowers, making these paper flowers, not only on Shavuos. And someone even sent me a book as a present. Ramesh Tzuriel, someone once gave him a book. He said, who's gonna have some hanad to have something to do with it? So he sent it to me as a present, and it turns out it relates to the sugya that people, instead of doing flowers, and maybe that the Gra was against, but so what they did is they would hang on the walls pictures of flowers. So it's not the same. Anyway, as early as I found Lamashal in a fascinating work, not for now, called Sefer Kundus, the Trickster, in 1824, reflecting Vilna. Twice he talks about the rezelach that they would hang on the walls in the shuls, in the house, in the form of flowers, so paper flowers. That's what I'm referring to. And the point is that this is another step with the minhag, and this is a lot. That's why the moras, in the preschools, they send them home with flowers, paper flowers, already, because they're trying to makayim the Gra and the Rama all together. Klal Yisrael likes to be mahader in all the different minhagim. Anyway, these are just some of the aspects relating to this Minhag Yisrael Torah, there's a lot to learn, a lot to discuss, a lot to be ma'arich about it, but this is just the Bekitzer Nimrots, some of the Nakudis behind the early origins of the flowers on Shavuos.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So a couple things before we wrap it up. You mentioned the Shelah, and we're recording this episode on Erev Rosh Chodesh Sivan. So what's your minhag? Do you say the tefillah for the skula? You begin with the shtickle that you mentioned earlier? What do you say?
I say is that if you learn Torah of the Shelah, then you're Mekayim, then you're for sure Mekayim, because who said even if the Shelah, it's not even clear if it's the Shlah's tefillah that he wrote it or others, or he took it from somewhere else. But Klal Yisrael, and especially in recent years, thanks to the power of the internet, took on this tefillah, and as they say, tefillah, especially for this with chinuch of children, is very important. But on the other hand, learning Torah of the Shelah is probably also, as a cold litvak, I would say that you're probably yaitza. The shaila is what the Chida, what the Shelah himself would rather you're doing. So that's a shaila. I can't answer that. It's too big of a shaila al regalachas to answer.
Excellent. You mentioned the Gra and Minhag Yerushalayim, like you said before, even though they're big into the Minhagim of the Goyin, seems like this one they left behind. But interestingly enough, if I recall, the yeshivas, I mean, someone could tell me, I don't think they put up decorations in Lakewood Yeshiva. When I was in Yeshiva, they didn't put up decorations. In my shul here, which, many of these schools in Lakewood, they like to follow Minhag Yeshiva, they don't put up flowers and things.
Right. Correct. It seems... I don't know a poll, but from pictures that I've seen, it sounds like some yeshivas do it, but I can't say that all. I can't say a thing because it could be changes. Certain years they do it. It could be who's the guy in the yeshiva at that time. He's a Hesa Bronik, so he doesn't do it. It has to take some a shul flowers. People have to do it to organize it and everything. So people, not necessarily because they don't do it is because there was a whole meeting of the Rosh Hashivas against it because we're doing the Gra. It just mean they didn't do it. On the other hand, sometimes it is because there was a meeting and we're doing the Gra. So, yeah.
Exactly. Okay, Yasher Koyach, thank you very much. And looking forward to the next episodes.